My daughter's millionaire boyfriend turned out to be my ex who abandoned me 26 years ago. I never expected our paths to cross again, especially not like this. At their wedding, I walked in wearing the dress he gifted me decades ago and his face went white when he saw me. I was holding my daughter's wedding invitation when I realized the groom's name wasn't printed anywhere on the elegant cardstock. "It's a surprise, Mom," Pamela had said when I called to ask about the omission. "He wants to make a dramatic entrance." 26 years of buried memories suddenly crashed over me as I wondered if some surprises were meant to destroy rather than delight. The invitation itself was stunning, cream-colored paper with gold embossing, the kind of expensive stationery that screamed money and taste. But where the groom's name should have been, there was just elegant script reading, "Request the honor of your presence at the marriage of Pamela Marie Harrison to her beloved." Her beloved. Not even a hint of identity. I set the invitation on my kitchen table and called Pamela immediately. She answered on the first ring, her voice bright with the kind of happiness I hadn't heard since she was a little girl on Christmas morning. "Isn't it beautiful, Mom?" He had them custom made by this exclusive printer in the city. He said he wanted everything to be perfect. "Pamela, honey, where's his name? There's no groom's name anywhere on this invitation." She laughed, that tinkling sound that used to make me smile but now sent warning bells through my head. "I told you it's going to be a surprise. He's planning this whole elaborate reveal for the ceremony. He says the mystery makes it more romantic." The word made my stomach clench. I'd heard that excuse before a lifetime ago, when I was young and naive enough to believe that secrecy could be charming instead of dangerous. I pressed my fingers against my temples, trying to push away the memories that threatened to surface. "Pamela, this is your wedding invitation. People need to know who you're marrying. What if they want to send gifts? What about the registry?" "Oh, Mom, you're being so practical. He's taking care of everything. The registry is at Nordstrom and Tiffany's, and he says people who really matter will know what to bring." Nordstrom and Tiffany's. My daughter, who had been shopping at Target and saving every penny since she was 16, was suddenly registered at stores I couldn't afford to window shop in. The woman who had worked 2 jobs through college, who had never asked me for financial help even when I knew she was eating ramen noodles for dinner 3 nights a week, was now talking about wedding registries that cost more than my annual salary. "Pamela, I need to meet this man. You've been dating for what, 3 months? And now you're getting married in 2 weeks? This is all happening so fast." The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its sparkle. "Mom, I know it seems quick, but when you know, you know. He makes me feel special. He makes me feel like I'm worth something." Those words cut deeper than she could have intended. Worth something. As if 24 years of unconditional love, of working double shifts to pay for her dance lessons and school supplies, of celebrating every small victory and holding her through every disappointment, hadn't already proven her worth. As if the sacrifices I'd made as a single mother meant nothing compared to whatever this mystery man was offering. "You've always been worth everything to me," I said quietly. "You don't need someone else to validate that." "That's not what I meant." Her voice sharpened with irritation. "I meant he sees potential in me. He believes in my dreams. He's already talking about investing in my photography business, maybe getting me studio space in Manhattan." Manhattan. My daughter, who had never lived more than 30 miles from where she was born, was suddenly making plans for Manhattan. With a man whose name she wouldn't even tell her own mother. "Pamela, please. Just let me meet him. Let me take you both to dinner. I promise I'll be on my best behavior. He's very busy with work right now. Big merger happening. But you'll meet him at the wedding, I promise. And Mom." Her voice softened again. "I really want you to be happy for me. This is the best thing that's ever happened to me." After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen staring at that invitation. The afternoon sun streamed through my window, highlighting the gold embossing that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I thought about the engagement ring Pamela had been flashing around town, a diamond so large it looked almost obscene on her delicate hand. Where had a 24-year-old gotten a ring like that? And more importantly, what kind of man gave such an expensive gift to someone he'd known for only 3 months? I walked to my bedroom and opened the closet door, pushing aside years of practical clothing until I reached the back corner. There, wrapped in tissue paper and stored in a box I hadn't opened in over 2 decades, was my own wedding dress. The dress I'd worn exactly once to a wedding that never happened. The dress that had cost me 3 months of savings and represented every hope I'd ever had for my future. I lifted the lid and touched the yellowed satin. The fabric still felt smooth beneath my fingers, though the color had faded from pure white to the shade of old ivory. I'd kept it all these years, unable to throw away something that had once meant so much, even after it became a symbol of my greatest humiliation. 26 years ago, I'd been just about Pamela's age when I fell head over heels for a charming man who made promises he never intended to keep. Larry had been everything I thought I wanted: handsome, confident, full of big dreams and bigger words. He'd swept me off my feet with expensive dinners and talk of our future together. The wedding was planned, the dress bought, the invitations sent. And then, on what should have been the happiest day of my life, I'd waited at the altar while 300 guests watched my dreams crumble. Larry never showed up. He'd emptied our joint savings account and disappeared, leaving me with nothing but debt, humiliation, and a positive pregnancy test I'd been planning to share with him on our honeymoon. I closed the box and pushed it back into the dark corner of my closet. That was ancient history. Just because my own experience had ended in disaster didn't mean Pamela was making the same mistake. But as I returned to the kitchen and looked at that anonymous wedding invitation again, I couldn't shake the feeling that history was about to repeat itself in the most devastating way possible. The phone rang, jarring me from my thoughts. It was my sister Carol calling about the invitation she'd received. "Amanda, what's going on? Who is this mystery man Pamela's marrying? The whole family is talking about it." I didn't have an answer then, but I was determined to find one before it was too late. 3 days after that unsettling phone call with Carol, I found myself downtown running the mundane errands that fill a quiet life, picking up dry cleaning, stopping at the pharmacy, grabbing groceries for one. The familiar routine usually brought me comfort, but today everything felt off-kilter, as if the world had tilted slightly and I was struggling to find my balance. I was walking past Romano's, the Italian restaurant that had been a downtown fixture for decades, when something made me glance through the large front window. The interior was dimly lit with warm amber lighting, filled with couples leaning across intimate tables. I almost kept walking, but then I saw her. Pamela sat at a corner table looking more radiant than I'd ever seen her. She wore a dress I didn't recognize, black silk that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and her hair was styled in an elegant updo that must have taken hours at some expensive salon. But it wasn't her transformation that stopped me cold. It was the man sitting across from her. From where I stood on the sidewalk, I could only see his profile, but something about the way he held himself made my chest tighten. His shoulders were broad beneath what looked like a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His salt and pepper hair was cut with the precision that only came from high-end salons. When he gestured while speaking, his movements had a confidence that bordered on arrogance, as if he owned not just the conversation but the entire room. I pressed myself against the window, ignoring the curious looks from other pedestrians. The man threw his head back and laughed at something Pamela had said, and that gesture, the way his chin lifted, the angle of his neck, sent an electric shock of recognition through my body. Oh, it couldn't be. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands, pretending to check messages while I studied his reflection in the window's glass. The years had changed him, certainly. The boyish face I remembered had matured into distinguished middle age. Where once there had been unruly brown curls, now there was silver threading through carefully styled hair. But the fundamental structure was the same. The strong jawline. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. As if sensing my scrutiny, he turned toward the window. Time collapsed. 26 years vanished in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Those green eyes, the same eyes I'd once thought held my entire future, met mine through the glass. The same crooked smile that had once made my knees weak now made my blood turn to ice water. The way he absently ran his fingers through his hair when he was pleased with himself, a gesture so familiar it might have happened yesterday instead of decades ago. Larry. The name echoed in my mind like a gunshot. Larry Brennan, the man who had promised to love me forever and then disappeared on our wedding day, leaving me pregnant, alone, and financially ruined. The father my daughter had never known because he'd never bothered to stay long enough to learn she existed. My legs gave out. I stumbled backward, bumping into a woman walking her dog, mumbling apologies I barely heard myself speak. My vision tunneled, the edges going dark as panic clawed at my throat. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But it was. Through the restaurant window, I watched as Larry, older, obviously wealthier, but unmistakably the same man who had destroyed my life, reached across the table to take my daughter's hand. Pamela's face glowed with the same starry-eyed adoration I'd once felt. The same naive trust that had nearly cost me everything. I somehow made it to my car, though I had no memory of walking there. My hands shook so violently I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock the door. Once inside, I gripped the steering wheel and tried to breathe, but each inhale felt like drowning. The cruel irony was suffocating. The man who had abandoned me pregnant was now romancing the child he'd never known he had. Was this coincidence? Some twisted cosmic joke? Or had Larry somehow discovered Pamela's existence and deliberately sought her out? My phone buzzed with a text from Pamela. Having dinner with my mystery man. He's taking me shopping afterward. Can't wait for you to meet him at the wedding. At stores like Tiffany's and Nordstrom, places she'd never been able to afford. Just like Larry had once taken me to expensive restaurants and boutiques, making me feel special and chosen while he systematically gained access to my savings account. I sat in that parking spot for over 2 hours, watching through the restaurant window as Larry worked his charm on my daughter. The same charm that had once swept me off my feet. I recognized every gesture, every calculated smile. The way he leaned forward when she spoke as if her words were the most fascinating thing he'd ever heard. The way he signaled the waiter with casual authority, ordering wine that probably cost more than my car payment. When they finally left the restaurant, Larry's hand possessively on Pamela's back, I followed them at a distance. They walked to a gleaming black Mercedes parked in front of the jewelry district. Through my windshield, I watched him open the passenger door for her with the same gallant flourish he'd once used on me. That evening I paced my living room until I wore a path in the carpet. Every instinct screamed that I had to warn Pamela. But how could I explain without revealing the whole truth? How could I tell my daughter that her perfect fiancé was actually her absent father, a man who had a history of using and abandoning women? When she called that night, her voice bubbling with excitement about the diamond bracelet Larry had bought her, I tried to plant seeds of caution. Pamela, honey, don't you think it's important to really know someone before you marry them? I mean, what about his past relationships? His family? His financial situation? She sighed, the sound carrying maternal frustration that cut me to the bone. Mom, you're doing that thing again. The thing where you assume every man is going to hurt me just because you got hurt. He's not Dad, okay? He's nothing like the man who abandoned us. If only she knew how right and how wrong she was at the same time. I'm just saying, 3 months isn't very long to know someone well enough to marry them. Mom, you're just scared because of what happened to you. But not every love story ends in disaster. Some of us actually get our happy ending. Her words hit their mark with surgical precision. After she hung up, I sat in the dark, wondering if I was seeing threats where none existed, if my own trauma was making me paranoid. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Larry's face through that restaurant window, and I knew with absolute certainty that my daughter was about to make the same mistake I had 26 years ago. The only difference was this time I might be able to stop it. The sleepless nights began immediately. I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through possibilities that grew more terrifying with each passing hour. By the third night of tossing and turning, I knew I couldn't handle this alone. I needed professional help. Someone who could dig deeper than my own frantic internet searches and social media stalking. Marcus Chen's office was located in a nondescript building downtown, the kind of place you'd walk past without noticing. His receptionist, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, offered me coffee while I waited. My hands shook too badly to hold the cup steady. When Marcus finally called me in, I was struck by how ordinary he looked. Average height, unremarkable features, the kind of man who could blend into any crowd. Exactly the qualities you'd want in a private investigator, I supposed. Mrs. Harrison, you mentioned on the phone that you're concerned about your daughter's fiancé. What specifically has you worried? I had rehearsed this moment, but sitting in his sparse office with its metal desk and filing cabinets, the words came tumbling out in a jumbled rush. I told him about the mysterious engagement, the anonymous wedding invitations, the expensive gifts that seemed to appear from nowhere. I showed him the few photos Pamela had posted on social media, careful shots that showed Larry from behind or in profile, never revealing his full face clearly. Marcus studied the images on my phone, his expression neutral. Then he opened his laptop and began typing, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. After several minutes he looked up and I saw something shift in his eyes. "Mrs. Harrison, I need you to understand something. I've been doing this job for 15 years and I've seen this man's face before. Multiple times, actually, in case files from other investigators. You're absolutely right to be concerned." The room seemed to tilt. "What do you mean?" He turned his laptop screen toward me. "This is a database we use to share information about suspected con artists and fraud cases. Your daughter's fiancé appears in at least 6 different files from the past decade alone. Different cities, different identities, but it's definitely the same man." The screen showed a collection of photos, some grainy surveillance shots, others clearly taken from dating profiles or social media. In every image, Larry looked slightly different. Sometimes clean-shaven, sometimes with a beard, hair varying in length and color, but his eyes remained the same. Those green eyes that had haunted my dreams for 26 years. "Tell me everything you know about him," Marcus said, pulling out a legal pad. I found myself sharing details I hadn't spoken aloud in decades. Larry's mannerisms, his favorite phrases, the way he'd convinced me to add his name to my bank account within weeks of our engagement. Marcus took notes without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that made me realize how many red flags I'd missed all those years ago. "Based on what you're telling me and what I already have in my files, I'd say your daughter is involved with a career criminal. Someone who's made a living targeting vulnerable women for financial exploitation. The pattern is always the same: intense courtship, expensive gifts to build trust, quick engagement, then systematic draining of assets." Over the next week, Marcus worked with contacts across multiple states to build a comprehensive picture of Larry's activities. The results were more devastating than I could have imagined. His real name was Lawrence Bradley Morrison, though he'd used at least a dozen aliases over the years. The pattern Marcus described wasn't speculation. It was documented fact. Larry would research potential victims carefully, often spending months learning about their financial situations before making contact. Widows were particularly favored targets, especially those who'd recently received life insurance payouts or inheritances. The photos Marcus showed me looked like a gallery of broken dreams. Sharon Martinez, a widow from Phoenix whose husband's death benefits had funded Larry's lifestyle for 8 months. Jennifer Walsh, a divorced teacher from Portland who'd trusted Larry with her disability settlement. Catherine Reed, whose inheritance from her parents had disappeared along with Larry after a whirlwind 6-month romance. Each woman had the same look in their pre-Larry photos: hope, vulnerability, the desire to believe in love again. The after photos, when they existed, showed hollow-eyed shells of their former selves. "I'd like you to speak with one of his recent victims," Marcus said during our second meeting. "Margaret Thompson. She's local and she's agreed to meet with you. Sometimes hearing directly from someone who's been through this helps families understand the severity of the situation." Margaret lived in a studio apartment in a building I'd driven past countless times without really seeing. The hallway smelled of cooking oil and loneliness. When she opened her door, I was struck by how small she seemed, as if life had physically diminished her. Her apartment was tidy but sparse. Furniture that had clearly been expensive once upon a time was now worn and faded. She served tea in mismatched cups, apologizing for not having proper china anymore. "I sold most everything," she explained, settling into a threadbare armchair. "Had to pay back what I could to the credit card companies. Harold would be so ashamed." Harold had been her husband of 38 years. Margaret showed me their wedding photo, a young couple glowing with happiness and promise. 6 months after Harold's death from cancer, Margaret had met Larry at a grief support group. "He didn't approach me right away," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was smart about it. He'd share in group about losing his wife, about how hard it was to imagine loving again. I felt such a connection to him. When he finally asked me for coffee, I felt like Harold was giving me permission to be happy again." The story that followed was painfully familiar. Expensive dinners, weekend trips, talk of traveling the world together once they were married. Larry had been patient, romantic, everything a grieving widow could want in a second chance at love. "He made me feel beautiful again," Margaret continued, tears tracking down her cheeks. "At 62, after watching Harold waste away for 2 years, I thought my life was over. Larry made me feel alive. He said we'd see Paris, Rome, all the places Harold and I never got to visit. Instead, Larry had systematically drained Harold's life insurance money, maxed out credit cards in Margaret's name, and disappeared the night before their planned wedding. Margaret had found herself not only heartbroken but financially ruined, forced to sell her home and move into this tiny apartment. Listening to her story, I felt pieces of my own past clicking into place like a terrible puzzle. The charm, the promises, the way Larry had made me feel special and chosen, it had all been calculated manipulation. 26 years ago, I'd been just another mark in his long con, another vulnerable woman to be exploited and discarded. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Pure and clean and terrifying in its intensity. Larry hadn't just broken my heart and abandoned his unborn daughter. He'd made a career of destroying women's lives. And now he'd targeted Pamela, his own child, for his final, most devastating con. As I left Margaret's apartment building that evening, I knew that stopping Larry wasn't just about saving my daughter anymore. It was about ending a cycle of destruction that had gone on far too long. I drove straight to Pamela's apartment from Margaret's building, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The weight of what I'd learned pressed against my chest like a physical force. Every fiber of my being screamed that I had to protect my daughter, but I also knew I couldn't reveal the full truth without destroying her in ways that might never heal. Pamela answered her door wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly utilities bill. Her hair was perfectly styled even though it was past 9 in the evening, and her makeup looked professionally done. The transformation from my practical, budget-conscious daughter to this polished version was so complete it felt like looking at a stranger. "Mom, what are you doing here so late?" She glanced nervously over her shoulder. "This really isn't a good time. We need to talk, Pamela. About your fiancé. I've learned some things that concern me." Her expression shifted from surprise to irritation. "What kind of things?" I had practiced this conversation during the drive over, trying to find the right balance between warning and honesty without revealing Larry's identity. I've heard rumors about his business practices. Some concerning stories about his past relationships. "Honey, I think you need to slow down and really investigate who this man is before you marry him." Pamela's face flushed red. "Rumors? From who? You don't even know him. You've never met him. You don't know anything about our relationship." "I know that he's keeping his identity secret from everyone, including his own bride's family. I know that expensive gifts and lavish spending in the early stages of a relationship can be a manipulation tactic. I know that 3 months isn't enough time to truly know someone well enough to pledge your life to them." "Oh, here we go." Pamela stepped back from the door, crossing her arms defensively. "This is about you, isn't it? This is about your own paranoia and trust issues. Just because your relationship failed doesn't mean mine will." The accusation stung, partly because there was truth in it. "Pamela, I'm not trying to sabotage your happiness. I'm trying to protect you from making a potentially devastating mistake. There are things about this man that you don't know." "What things? What exactly have you heard?" Her voice rose, carrying across the apartment hallway. A neighbor's door cracked open briefly before closing again. I struggled to find words that would convey the danger without revealing everything. "He has a pattern of targeting vulnerable women. He makes big promises and then disappears with their money. I've spoken to people who know his history." "That's ridiculous." Pamela's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You've been investigating my fiancé? You hired someone to spy on the man I love? How dare you?" "Pamela, please listen to me. I've seen documentation. There are other women who've been hurt by the same man. The same promises, the same expensive gifts, the same rush to marriage. You fit his pattern perfectly." "His pattern?" She took another step back, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're sick, Mom. You're actually sick. You can't stand that I found someone who loves me, who wants to take care of me, who sees my potential. You're so bitter about your own failures that you're trying to destroy my happiness." The words cut deeper than any physical blow could have. "Pamela, that's not true. Everything I've done has been to protect you." "Protect me from what?" "From love. From security. From a man who treats me like a queen." Her voice cracked with emotion. "You raised me to be independent and strong, and now that I am, you can't handle it. You can't handle that I don't need you anymore. You don't understand. This man is dangerous. He's not who he appears to be." "You know what's dangerous?" Pamela's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. A mother who's so consumed with her own damage that she's willing to sabotage her daughter's chance at happiness. You're poisoning my happiness because you can't stand that I found love when you couldn't. She slammed the door so hard the sound echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. I stood there for several minutes, staring at the closed door, hoping she might reconsider and open it again. When that didn't happen, I knocked softly and called her name. No response. I tried calling her phone from the hallway and heard it ringing inside the apartment, but she didn't answer. The drive home felt endless. Every red light gave me more time to replay the conversation, to wonder if I'd handled it wrong, if there had been some other approach that might have reached her. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was questioning everything I thought I knew. The next 3 days were torture. Pamela didn't return my calls or respond to my texts. When I drove by her apartment, her car was gone. I tried reaching her at work, but her coworker said she'd taken vacation time to spend with her fiancé. Her social media accounts, which had never been private before, were suddenly blocked to me. For the first time in 24 years, my daughter and I were completely estranged, and Larry was the cause. I found myself wandering through my empty house like a ghost, questioning every decision I'd made. Was I the bitter, suspicious woman Pamela had accused me of being? Had my own trauma made me see threats where none existed? Margaret's story had seemed so compelling, but what if I'd misunderstood? What if Larry had genuinely changed over the decades? The doubt was almost worse than the certainty had been. At least when I'd been sure of Larry's guilt, I'd had a clear purpose. Now I felt unmoored, adrift in a sea of second-guessing that left me exhausted and confused. On the 4th day, unable to bear the silence any longer, I drove to the downtown area where I'd first spotted Larry and Pamela together. I told myself I was just running errands, but I knew I was hoping to catch another glimpse of them, to see some evidence that would either validate my concerns or put them to rest. I found them at a high-end art gallery, studying paintings that cost more than my annual salary. Larry stood behind Pamela with his arms around her waist, whispering something in her ear that made her laugh. The gesture was so familiar it took my breath away. He'd held me exactly the same way 26 years ago when we'd window shopped at galleries I couldn't afford. They moved through the gallery like a perfectly matched couple, Larry's hand possessively on Pamela's back, guiding her from piece to piece. I watched from across the street as he spoke to the gallery owner, his manner confident and charming. The same confidence that had once made me feel special and chosen. The parallel was so exact it felt like watching my own past replay in slow motion, and I knew with devastating certainty that I hadn't been wrong about anything. That evening, I called Marcus from my car while still parked across from the art gallery. The sight of Larry manipulating my daughter with the exact same gestures he'd once used on me had shattered any remaining doubt about his intentions. I need to meet with more of his victims, I told Marcus without preamble. I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Marcus's voice was grim. I've been hoping you'd say that. I've located 2 other women who were involved with Larry in the past 18 months. Both are local and both are willing to talk. Can you meet tomorrow afternoon? The coffee shop Marcus chose was in a strip mall on the outskirts of town, the kind of anonymous place where people could meet without attracting attention. I arrived early and claimed a corner table, my nerves stretched tight with anticipation and dread. Jessica arrived first, a petite woman with flour-dusted fingernails and tired eyes that looked older than her 28 years. She moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned not to trust her own judgment. When she sat down, she immediately began arranging the sugar packets in neat rows, a nervous habit that spoke to deeper anxiety. Marcus said you're trying to stop him before he hurts someone else, she said without looking up from the sugar packets. I want to help, but talking about it still makes me feel sick. Sarah joined us 10 minutes later, leaning heavily on a walking cane that suggested her car accident injuries were more severe than Marcus had indicated. She was 35 but moved like someone much older, each step carefully calculated. When she shook my hand, I noticed the slight tremor that spoke to ongoing pain medication or persistent nerve damage. So we're all part of Larry's collection, Sarah said, settling into her chair with visible discomfort. Lucky us. As we ordered coffee and tentatively began sharing our stories, the true scope of Larry's operation became horrifyingly clear. Jessica had met him at a small business networking event, where he'd presented himself as a successful restaurant investor looking for promising opportunities. Her bakery had been struggling but showing potential, and Larry had swept in with promises of expansion funding and partnership. He made it seem like I was exactly what he'd been looking for, Jessica explained, her voice barely above a whisper. A talented baker with vision but limited capital. He said he'd been searching for someone like me for years, someone who understood that food was about more than just business. It was about bringing joy to people's lives. The familiar pattern made my stomach churn. Larry had used almost identical language with me decades ago, talking about how he'd been waiting his whole life to find someone who understood his dreams and ambitions. Sarah's story followed the same blueprint with surgical precision. She'd been recovering from the car accident that had ended her teaching career, dealing with chronic pain and facing an uncertain future. Larry had appeared at her physical therapy clinic, charming the staff and presenting himself as a successful businessman who'd overcome his own health challenges. He told me about his back injury from a skiing accident, how it had changed his perspective on what really mattered in life, Sarah said, unconsciously rubbing her left shoulder. He said meeting me proved that everything happened for a reason, that our shared experience with recovery had brought us together for a purpose. Larry had courted Sarah for 3 months, just long enough to gain her complete trust before suggesting they combine their resources for their future together. Her car accident settlement, intended to provide security during her recovery, had disappeared along with Larry after what should have been their engagement celebration. The worst part wasn't losing the money, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. It was realizing how perfectly he'd played me. Every conversation we'd had, every intimate moment we'd shared, he'd been calculating exactly how to get what he wanted. I felt like such a fool. Jessica nodded emphatically. That's exactly it. The financial loss was devastating, but the psychological damage was worse. He made me question everything about my own judgment. I stopped trusting my instincts about people completely. As we talked, Marcus arrived with a thick folder of documents. His investigation had revealed that Larry's current lifestyle was funded entirely through an intricate network of shell companies and fraudulent investments. The expensive restaurants, the luxury car, the designer suits, all of it was smoke and mirrors built on money stolen from women like us. He's gotten more sophisticated over the years, Marcus explained, spreading papers across our small table. The Larry who left you pregnant 26 years ago was operating on a much smaller scale. Now he's running what amounts to a criminal enterprise. The documentation was overwhelming. Bank records showing systematic transfers from victim accounts to Larry's various business entities. Corporate filings for companies that existed only on paper. Credit applications using false information and stolen identities. Larry hadn't just evolved from a petty con artist, he'd become a predator operating at a professional level. He's already started working on your daughter, Marcus continued, his expression grave. We've tracked several small transfers from her accounts to companies he controls. Nothing large enough to trigger suspicion, but definitely part of a pattern we've seen before. The room seemed to tilt. While I'd been frantically trying to warn Pamela about Larry's past, he'd already begun draining her finances in preparation for a larger theft. That night, I drove home and went straight to my bedroom closet. I pushed aside years of practical clothing until I reached the back corner, where my wedding dress hung in its protective bag like a museum piece. I hadn't looked at it in years, but now I lifted it out and held it against myself in front of the full-length mirror. The fabric was still pristine, the beadwork still catching light the way it had 26 years ago. I'd been so young when I'd chosen this dress, so full of hope and trust and naive belief in happily ever after. Looking at my reflection now, I saw not just the passage of time but the accumulation of wisdom earned through pain. This dress had once represented everything I'd wanted to become. Now it could represent everything Larry had destroyed. If I wore it to Pamela's wedding, it would be like bringing a ghost to the ceremony, a reminder of all the promises Larry had broken and all the women he'd betrayed. Over the following weeks, our informal group of victims began meeting regularly. Margaret, Jessica, Sarah, and I gathered documentation, shared memories, and built a comprehensive case against Larry that went far beyond any individual story of heartbreak. We saved voicemails where he'd made promises he never intended to keep. We compiled financial records showing his systematic theft. We documented his lies with the methodical thoroughness of women who'd finally found a way to fight back. What had started as my desperate attempt to save Pamela had become something larger, A mission to ensure that Larry never had the opportunity to destroy another woman's life. We were no longer just victims. We'd become witnesses, investigators, and ultimately instruments of justice. The wedding dress hung in my closet like a loaded weapon, waiting for the right moment to fire. 2 weeks before the wedding, I was jolted awake by urgent knocking at my front door. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 12:17 a.m., and my first thought was that something terrible had happened. I threw on my robe and hurried downstairs, peering through the peephole to see Pamela standing on my porch in the rain. She looked nothing like the polished woman I'd been watching from afar. Her hair hung in wet tangles around her face, her makeup was streaked with tears, and she was shivering in a thin dress that was completely inappropriate for the October chill. When I opened the door, she collapsed into my arms without a word, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside her. I guided her to the living room couch, wrapping her in the throw blanket I kept draped over the back. For several minutes she couldn't speak coherently through the tears. I made her tea with shaking hands, my mind racing through possibilities. Had Larry hurt her physically? Had she discovered something about his past on her own? "Mom, I think I made a mistake," she finally whispered, accepting the warm mug with trembling hands. "Something happened tonight that made me feel, I don't know how to explain it, like I was watching myself from outside my body, and I didn't recognize the person I was becoming." I sat beside her on the couch, every maternal instinct screaming to hold her close while my analytical mind catalogued each word she spoke. "What happened, sweetheart?" We were at dinner and he started talking about our honeymoon plans. How we needed to make sure all our finances were properly organized before we left. He said it would be easier if I added his name to my bank accounts now so he could handle any issues that came up while we were traveling. Pamela's voice grew stronger as she continued, though her hands still shook around the tea mug. When I hesitated, he got this look in his eyes. Not angry exactly, but calculating. Like he was reassessing me as a person. My blood turned to ice water, but I forced my voice to remain calm. "That seems like a reasonable thing to want to discuss before a wedding." That's what I thought at first. But then he started listing everything he knew about my financial situation. Not just the obvious things, but details I'd mentioned casually months ago. My inheritance from Grandma Helen. The savings account I've been building since I was 16. Even the college fund you started for my future children. She looked at me with eyes that suddenly seemed much older. "Mom, how does someone remember every financial detail you've ever shared, but forget your favorite flower or the name of your childhood pet?" The question hung between us like a physical presence. I wanted to tell her everything right then, to explain that Larry's selective memory was a professional skill honed over decades of exploitation. Instead, I chose my words carefully. Sometimes when people are focused on practical matters like money, they remember those details more clearly than emotional ones. But I understand why that would feel unsettling. Pamela set down her tea and turned to face me fully. "There's something else." When I said I needed to think about the bank account thing, he started talking about how marriage required complete trust and transparency. How holding back financially was the same as holding back emotionally. "But Mom, we've only been together 4 months. Is it normal to feel like someone knows more about your life than you remember telling them?" The irony was crushing. Larry had spent decades perfecting his ability to extract information while appearing casually interested, and Pamela was finally recognizing the manipulation for what it was. But she was seeing it through the lens of a normal relationship gone wrong, not understanding that every moment of their courtship had been carefully orchestrated. "Trust your instincts," I said quietly. "If something feels wrong, it probably is." She curled up against my side the way she used to when she was little and scared of thunderstorms. "I keep thinking about what you said before. About not really knowing someone after such a short time. I got so angry at you for saying that, but tonight at dinner I realized I couldn't answer basic questions about his childhood or his family. Every time I've asked, he changes the subject or gives vague answers about it being too painful to discuss." I stroked her damp hair, my heart breaking for the innocence she was losing in real time. "Would you like to stay here tonight? You don't have to make any decisions right now." She nodded against my shoulder and I helped her upstairs to her old bedroom. The room was exactly as she'd left it when she moved out after college. Band posters on the walls, her high school trophies on the dresser, the twin bed with the quilt I'd made when she turned 16. Watching her curl up under that familiar quilt, looking young and vulnerable in her childhood space, I felt the full weight of the impossible situation Larry had created. After she fell asleep, I sat in the hallway outside her door, wrestling with a decision that felt like it would define the rest of our relationship. Should I tell her that Larry was her father? That the man she'd fallen in love with was the same person who had abandoned her before she was born? The truth would destroy her, but keeping the secret felt like another layer of betrayal. I thought about Margaret, Jessica, and Sarah, about all the women who had suffered because no one had warned them about Larry's true nature. But they had been strangers to Larry when he targeted them. Pamela was his own daughter, though he clearly didn't recognize her. I studied her sleeping face in the dim light from the hallway, searching for traces of Larry in her features. She had his chin, his long eyelashes, the way her nose crinkled slightly when she dreamed. How could he spend months courting her without seeing himself reflected in her face? The answer was as simple as it was horrifying. Larry had never bothered to look closely enough at me 26 years ago to remember what I looked like, let alone imagine what our child might become. The next morning, Pamela joined me for breakfast at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals over the years. She looked better after sleeping, though the worry lines around her eyes hadn't completely faded. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, pouring herself coffee from the pot I'd made extra strong. "About really knowing someone before you marry them. I realized last night that I don't even know his middle name." We talked for 2 hours, and with each revelation my heart sank deeper. Larry knew about every aspect of Pamela's financial life because he'd systematically extracted that information over months of careful questioning. He knew about her inheritance, her savings, her credit score, her investment accounts, even the modest retirement fund she'd started at her job. He'd positioned himself to access everything she owned, just as he'd done with Margaret, Jessica, Sarah, and countless other women. When she finally left that morning, Pamela was still planning to go through with the wedding despite her growing doubts. "Maybe I'm just having pre-wedding jitters," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Everyone says it's normal to have second thoughts before such a big commitment." After she drove away, I stood in my kitchen staring at the anonymous wedding invitation still propped against the sugar bowl. The wedding was in 12 days, and my daughter was walking into a trap that would destroy not just her financial future but potentially her ability to ever trust again. I made my decision then, standing in that quiet kitchen with morning sunlight streaming through the windows. I would attend the wedding wearing the dress Larry had given me 26 years ago. If he wanted to complete his destruction of our family, he would have to face the ghost of his past crimes first. The plan crystallized in my mind with startling clarity. I reached for my phone and dialed Margaret's number first, my hands steadier than they had been in weeks. "Margaret, it's Amanda Harrison. I need to ask something of you that might sound completely insane, but I think it's our only chance to stop Larry before he destroys another life." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "What do you need me to do?" "I want you to come to Pamela's wedding with me. As my guest. I'm going to expose Larry in front of everyone, and I need you there to back up my story with yours." Margaret's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. "Amanda, I can't face him again. I'm barely holding myself together as it is. Seeing him, being in the same room with him." "I know what I'm asking," I said gently. "I know it's terrifying. But Margaret, he's about to do to my daughter exactly what he did to you. She's already starting to see through his lies, but she doesn't have the full picture. If we don't act now, she'll end up like us, broken and penniless. Except she's his own daughter and he doesn't even know it." The weight of that revelation seemed to travel through the phone line. Margaret was quiet for a long moment before speaking again, and when she did, her voice carried a strength I hadn't heard before. "His own daughter. My God, Amanda. Yes, I'll be there. That monster needs to be stopped." Jessica answered on the first ring when I called her 20 minutes later. Her voice was tense as if she'd been expecting bad news. "It's Amanda. I have a favor to ask and you're going to think I've lost my mind. After everything we've been through with Larry, nothing would surprise me anymore." "What do you need?" I explained the plan, watching through my kitchen window as neighbors went about their normal Friday evening routines, walking dogs, bringing in mail, completely unaware that I was planning to detonate a bomb at a wedding the following day. "You want us to confront him publicly? At his wedding?" Jessica's voice climbed higher with each word. "Amanda, what if he gets violent? What if he tries to hurt you or your daughter? Larry's not physically dangerous. He's a coward who relies on charm and manipulation. When those fail, he runs. But he can't run from a room full of people who know exactly who he is. Sarah was the hardest call to make. Her physical limitations meant that attending the wedding would require significant effort and discomfort, and I hated asking her to endure that for my family's sake. "I'll pick you up," I said after explaining the situation. "I'll make sure you have everything you need to be comfortable. But Sarah, I need you there. Your story about how he targeted you during your recovery, it shows a pattern that even the most skeptical wedding guest won't be able to dismiss. I've been waiting 3 years for a chance to make him pay for what he did to me," Sarah said, and I could hear the steel in her voice. "I'll be ready." After the calls were made, I went upstairs to face the dress. I hadn't taken it out of its protective bag since that night weeks ago when I'd first conceived this plan. Now, with the wedding less than 24 hours away, I needed to make sure it still fit and that I could actually go through with wearing it. The bedroom was quiet except for the sound of my own breathing as I unzipped the garment bag. The dress emerged like a ghost from the past, its ivory silk still lustrous despite the passage of years. I held it up against myself in front of the full-length mirror, and for a moment I was 24 again, standing in a bridal shop, drunk on love and the promise of forever. Putting on the dress was like stepping into a time machine. The fabric settled around my body with surprising familiarity, though I could feel the subtle changes that 26 years in childbirth had wrought. The waist sat slightly differently now, and the neckline revealed the fine lines that had accumulated around my collarbones. But it still fit, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw both the young woman who had believed in fairy tales and the older woman who had learned to fight her own battles. The dress had been beautiful once, chosen with care and hope and dreams of a perfect future. Tomorrow it would serve a different purpose entirely. It would be armor, a weapon forged from betrayal and tempered by time. Larry would see it and know immediately that his carefully constructed new identity was about to crumble. Marcus arrived at my door that evening with a thick manila envelope tucked under his arm. His expression was grim as he handed it over. "This is everything we've compiled on Larry Morrison, also known as Lawrence Bradley Lawrence Brennan, and at least 6 other aliases we've identified. The FBI has been building a case for months, apparently. Your situation just gave them the final pieces they needed." I opened the envelope and felt my stomach drop. The documentation was even more extensive than I had imagined. Bank records showing systematic theft from over 15 women across multiple states. False identity documents. Tax evasion on an industrial scale. Credit card fraud. Money laundering through his network of shell companies. "How long has he been doing this?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Based on what we can prove, at least 20 years. Probably longer. Amanda, this man isn't just a con artist, he's operating what amounts to a criminal enterprise. The FBI estimates he's stolen over $2 million from victims like you." $2 million. The number was staggering, representing not just money but decades of destroyed lives, broken dreams and shattered trust. "They'll be ready to move tomorrow," Marcus continued. "After your confrontation at the wedding, they'll arrest him on federal charges. He won't be able to disappear this time." After Marcus left, I found myself unable to sleep. I made a cup of tea and sat on my back porch, wrapped in an old quilt, watching the stars and thinking about the path that had led me to this moment. 26 years ago I had been so young, so trusting, so eager to believe that love could conquer anything. I had ignored red flags, dismissed my own instincts, and handed over my heart and my future to a man who saw me as nothing more than an opportunity for profit. But that young woman's naive trust had created something precious, Pamela. Despite the circumstances of her conception, despite being raised by a single mother who sometimes barely held things together, my daughter had grown into someone extraordinary. Someone worth fighting for. Tomorrow, I would walk into that wedding venue wearing the dress Larry had given me as a promise he never intended to keep. I would stand up in front of everyone and reveal the truth about the man who had destroyed my life and was now trying to destroy my daughter's. And this time I wouldn't be facing him alone. Dawn broke gray and overcast, matching the weight that had settled in my chest during the sleepless hours. I rose from my back porch chair where I'd spent most of the night, my joints stiff from the October chill. The wedding dress hung on my bedroom door like a specter, catching the pale morning light that filtered through my curtains. I moved through my morning routine with mechanical precision, each action deliberate and measured. foundation to cover the dark circles under my eyes, concealer for the stress lines that had deepened over the past month, lipstick in a shade that would complement the ivory silk I was about to wear as armor. My hands remained steady as I applied mascara, though my stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and dread that made eating impossible. Through my bedroom window, I could see movement in Pamela's apartment. The silhouette of her bridesmaids bustling about, probably arranging flowers and sipping champagne while she transformed into a bride. The sounds of laughter drifted across the narrow space between our buildings, and I imagined my daughter's face glowing with the happiness I was about to shatter. The wedding dress slipped over my head with surprising ease, the silk settling against my skin like a familiar embrace. I stood before my full-length mirror, adjusting the neckline and smoothing the skirt, and saw two women reflected back at me. The young bride-to-be who had worn this dress with such hope 26 years ago, and the battle-worn mother who would wear it today as a weapon of justice. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Jessica, Sarah, and I are on our way to the venue. Are you ready for this? I typed back, as ready as anyone can be to face their demons. The venue was exactly what I had expected from Larry's carefully cultivated taste. The Grandview estate sat on a hilltop overlooking the city, its neoclassical architecture suggesting old money and established tradition. Marble columns flanked the entrance and crystal chandeliers visible through tall windows promised elegance within. It was the kind of place that would photograph beautifully and impress even the most discerning guest. I parked at the far end of the lot, needing a few moments to compose myself before entering. Other guests were arriving in luxury vehicles, men in tailored suits and women in designer dresses that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. These people clearly believed they were celebrating the union of a successful businessman and his fortunate bride. They had no idea they were about to witness the unmasking of a career criminal. Margaret, Jessica, and Sarah were waiting near the entrance, huddled together like survivors of a shipwreck. Margaret wore a navy dress that was elegant but showed the careful mending of someone living on a tight budget. Jessica had chosen simple black, professional but understated. Sarah leaned heavily on her walking cane, but her expression held a determination I had never seen before. "You look," Margaret began, then stopped, studying my dress with recognition dawning in her eyes. "Like a ghost from his past," I finished. "That's exactly what I'm going for." We entered the venue together, our small group of women united by shared trauma and purpose. The interior was even more opulent than I had anticipated. Ivory roses and white lilies adorned every surface, their fragrance heavy in the air. Guests filled ornate chairs arranged in perfect rows, their conversations creating a low hum of anticipation. I spotted several people I recognized from around town, business owners and civic leaders who would lend credibility to whatever story Larry had told about his background. They nodded politely as we passed, clearly wondering who we were but too well-mannered to stare openly. We took seats in the back, where we would have a clear view of the proceedings but remain inconspicuous until the moment came to act. Sarah settled carefully into her chair and Jessica reached over to squeeze her hand. Margaret sat ramrod straight, her jaw set with resolve. The processional music began, a string quartet playing Pachelbel's canon with professional precision. Bridesmaids glided down the aisle in dusty rose gowns, their bouquets perfectly arranged, their smiles radiant. The wedding party looked like something from a magazine spread, every detail calculated to create an atmosphere of romance and luxury. Then Pamela appeared at the back of the aisle and my breath caught in my throat. She was absolutely luminous in her wedding gown, a vision of hope and joy that made my chest ache with conflicted emotions. Her dress was a masterpiece of lace and silk, clearly custom-made and probably costing more than I earned in 6 months. Her veil floated behind her like a cloud, and her face glowed with the kind of happiness that comes from believing you have found your perfect match. For a moment, watching her walk down that aisle with such confidence and radiance, I questioned everything. Was I about to destroy my daughter's chance at happiness based on 26-year-old wounds and circumstantial evidence? What if Larry had genuinely changed? What if this was real love and I was about to ruin it out of my own bitterness and paranoia? But then I saw him. Larry stood at the altar in a tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's cars, his silver hair perfectly styled, his posture confident and commanding. He looked every inch the successful businessman, the catch of a lifetime, the answer to a young woman's dreams. But when his eyes swept across the assembled guests in that automatic way grooms do while waiting for their bride, his gaze landed on me. The transformation was instantaneous and devastating. His face drained of all color, going from healthy tan to ash gray in the space of a heartbeat. His confident posture crumbled as his shoulders sagged forward. His hands, which had been clasped calmly behind his back, began to tremble visibly. For just a moment his carefully constructed mask slipped completely, and I saw the coward beneath the charm, the frightened man who had built his entire life on lies and deception. 26 years of carefully maintained identity evaporated as Larry stared at me in that wedding dress, understanding immediately what my presence meant. I was his past come to claim him, the ghost of crimes he thought he had buried forever. In my ivory silk and determined expression, he saw the collapse of everything he had built with other women's money and broken hearts. The officiant was speaking, welcoming the guests and beginning the ceremony, but Larry's attention remained fixed on me. I saw him struggling to regain his composure, his trained charm warring with genuine panic. His mouth moved silently, perhaps trying to convince himself that I was a figment of his imagination, a stress-induced hallucination that would disappear if he just looked away. But I remained solidly real, sitting in that back row like justice personified, flanked by 3 other women whose lives he had destroyed. Margaret caught his eye next, and I watched him recognize her with a visible flinch. Then Jessica, then Sarah. One by one his victims revealed themselves, and with each recognition, Larry's facade cracked a little more. Pamela, radiant in her innocence, continued her walk down the aisle, oblivious to the drama unfolding between her mother and her groom. She had eyes only for the man she thought was her future, the wealthy businessman who had swept her off her feet with promises of love and security. In less than 10 minutes I would stand up and shatter those illusions forever. The officiant's voice carried across the hushed venue as he reached the traditional words that had echoed through countless ceremonies. If anyone present knows of any reason why this couple should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft rustle of expensive fabric as guests shifted in their seats. This was always the moment when everyone held their breath, though in most weddings it passed without incident. Today would be different. I rose from my seat in the back row, the ivory silk of my 26-year-old wedding dress catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. The movement seemed to ripple through the assembled guests like a stone dropped in still water. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. Heads turned in my direction. Even the string quartet faltered for a moment before falling completely silent. "I have something to say," I announced, my voice carrying with surprising strength across the marble-floored venue. The acoustics were perfect, ensuring that every word would reach every ear, including Pamela's at the altar. Larry's face had gone from ash gray to paper white, but he was clearly trying to salvage the situation. I saw him lean slightly toward the officiant, probably preparing to dismiss me as a mentally unstable wedding crasher. But I wasn't finished speaking. "This man gave me this very dress 26 years ago for our wedding day," I continued, smoothing the silk skirt with hands that had stopped trembling the moment I committed to action. "We had planned our future together. We had sent out invitations, booked a venue, chosen flowers. And then, on what should have been the happiest day of my life, he disappeared. He emptied our joint bank account and vanished, leaving me pregnant and alone." The gasps from the crowd were audible now, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the air from the room. I saw wedding guests exchange shocked glances, their expressions shifting from polite attention to horrified fascination. Several people had their phones out, though whether they were calling for security or recording the scene I couldn't tell. Larry stepped forward, his training in crisis management finally kicking in. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption," he said, his voice projecting the calm authority he'd perfected over decades of deception. "This woman is clearly suffering from some sort of mental breakdown. She's confusing me with someone from her past. I've never seen her before in my life." His lie was so smooth, so convincing, that for a moment I could see doubt creeping into some of the guests' expressions. This was exactly what Larry did best: redirect blame, create confusion, make his victims seem unreliable while he appeared reasonable and sympathetic. But I wasn't alone this time. Margaret stood up from her seat beside me, her navy dress a stark contrast to the pastel elegance surrounding us. "My name is Margaret Thompson," she said, her voice shaking but determined. This man stole my husband's life insurance money after Harold died of cancer. He promised to marry me, promised we'd travel the world together. Instead, he maxed out credit cards in my name and disappeared the night before our wedding. A murmur ran through the crowd, and I saw several guests turning to stare at Larry with new suspicion. His confident demeanor was beginning to crack, though he still maintained his posture at the altar. Jessica rose next, her baker's hands clasped tightly in front of her. "He destroyed my business," she said simply. "Convinced me to invest my life savings in a fake expansion opportunity. I lost everything: my bakery, my apartment, my credit rating. Also, he could fund his lifestyle while he searched for his next victim." The murmur grew louder, more agitated. I could see wedding guests beginning to connect the dots, their expressions shifting from confusion to outrage. Larry's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his prepared responses clearly inadequate for this coordinated exposure. Sarah was the last to stand, using her walking cane for support as she faced the crowd. "He targeted me when I was recovering from a car accident that ended my teaching career. He knew I was vulnerable, knew I had a settlement coming. He made me believe he understood my pain because he'd supposedly been through the same thing. Every word was a lie designed to access my money." The venue erupted in chaos. Wedding guests were on their feet, some demanding explanations, others backing toward the exits. I could hear fragments of angry conversations, people putting together their own pieces of Larry's deception. Several guests were frantically making phone calls, probably to their own banks and financial advisors. But through all the noise and confusion, my eyes were on Pamela. She stood frozen at the altar in her beautiful gown, her bouquet trembling in her hands as she looked from Larry to me and back again. I watched as understanding dawned in her eyes, the terrible realization that the fairy tale she'd been living was actually a nightmare. The color drained from her face as she processed not just the betrayal, but the deeper, more devastating truth I hadn't yet spoken aloud. "Pamela," I called out, my voice somehow carrying across the chaos. "There's something else you need to know. This man is your father. He's the one who abandoned us both." The words seemed to freeze everyone in place. The angry conversations stopped. The confused murmurs ceased. Even the photographers who had been documenting what they thought would be a romantic celebration lowered their cameras in shock. Pamela staggered backward, her wedding bouquet falling forgotten to the marble floor. Her hands went to her face as if she could somehow block out what she'd just heard. The beautiful wedding dress that had made her look like a princess now seemed to hang on her like a costume from a play that had gone horribly wrong. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible but somehow carrying across the silent venue. "No, that can't be true. That's not possible." Larry made his move then, probably recognizing that his only chance was to flee before the situation deteriorated further. He turned toward the side exit, abandoning his bride, his wedding, and his carefully constructed identity in one desperate motion. He never made it to the door. Two men in dark suits stepped into his path, their movements coordinated and professional. FBI agents, exactly as Marcus had promised. They'd been waiting outside, ready to move the moment our confrontation exposed Larry's true nature. "Lawrence Bradley Morrison," one of the agents announced, his voice cutting through the stunned silence as he produced handcuffs. "You're under arrest for mail fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering." The sight of Larry being handcuffed in his expensive tuxedo, surrounded by the wreckage of his final con, was something I'd dreamed about for 26 years. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the exposure of his true nature. The confident businessman was gone, replaced by exactly what he'd always been beneath the expensive suits and practiced charm, a petty criminal who preyed on women's hopes and dreams. As the agents led him away, Larry's eyes met mine one final time. In that moment I saw not anger or defiance but something that looked almost like relief. Perhaps carrying the weight of so many lies for so many years had finally become unbearable, even for someone as morally bankrupt as Larry Morrison. The venue was in complete chaos now, but I only had eyes for Pamela, who stood alone at the altar in her ruined wedding dress, finally understanding the true cost of her father's legacy. The empty wedding venue felt like the aftermath of a battlefield. Crystal chandeliers cast their elegant light over scattered programs and abandoned boutonnieres, while the sweet scent of crushed flowers mixed with the lingering tension in the air. Most of the guests had fled, some in anger, others in embarrassment at having been unknowing participants in Larry's final con. Pamela stood alone at the altar, still in her wedding dress but looking nothing like the radiant bride who had walked down the aisle an hour earlier. Her veil hung askew, her makeup streaked with tears, and her hands shook as she stared at the spot where Larry had been standing when the FBI agents took him away. I approached her slowly, the ivory silk of my own dress rustling against the marble floor. When I reached her, she looked up at me with eyes that held a complexity of emotions I couldn't fully read: devastation, humiliation, anger, and something that might have been relief. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking on the single word. I opened my arms, and she collapsed into them with the force of someone who had been holding herself upright through sheer will. We stood there in the wreckage of her wedding day, both crying but for entirely different reasons. Her tears were for the loss of innocence, for the shattering of dreams, for the cruel realization that the man she'd trusted with her heart and future was the same person who had abandoned her before she was born. My tears were for her pain, for the years of secrets I'd carried, and for the relief of finally having the truth in the open. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed against my shoulder. "You tried to warn me and I wouldn't listen. I said such horrible things to you. I thought you were jealous, bitter, unable to accept my happiness. But you were trying to protect me the whole time. I should have told you the truth from the beginning," I replied, stroking her hair through the expensive styling that was now coming undone. "I should have told you who he really was instead of trying to spare you the pain. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really protecting myself from having to relive those memories." She pulled back to look at me, mascara creating dark tracks down her cheeks. "He's really my father? The man who left us?" I nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat. How could he not recognize me? How could he court his own daughter without knowing? The question cut deep because it revealed the most painful truth about Larry, that he had cared so little about me 26 years ago that he'd never bothered to really look at my face, never wondered about the child he'd left behind, never gave either of us a second thought after he'd gotten what he wanted. "Because you were never real to him," I said gently. "None of us were. We were just opportunities, assets to be exploited and then forgotten. He probably never even considered that he might have a child out there." Margaret, Jessica, and Sarah approached us cautiously, their own faces showing the emotional toll of confronting their shared tormentor. Margaret was the first to speak. "Pamela, honey, I know this is devastating. But you should know that what your mother did today took incredible courage. She saved you from years of financial and emotional destruction. The months that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and gradual healing. Larry's arrest had made national news, partly because of the dramatic circumstances at the wedding, but mostly because the FBI's investigation revealed the staggering scope of his criminal enterprise. The wedding video, recorded by the photographer and later released by the FBI as part of their public appeal for additional victims, went viral on social media. Over 20 women came forward with their own stories of betrayal at Larry's hands. Each testimony strengthened the federal case against him, painting a picture of systematic fraud that spanned nearly 3 decades. The FBI estimated his total theft at over $3 million, representing not just money but decades of destroyed lives and shattered trust. Larry was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in federal prison on multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and tax evasion. The courtroom was packed during his sentencing hearing, with many of his victims present to see justice finally served. He looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit than he had in his expensive suits, and when given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, he remained silent. Pamela attended the hearing with me, sitting in the front row as the judge delivered the sentence that would keep her father behind bars for most of his remaining productive years. She had chosen to face him one final time, not for closure but for confirmation that the man she'd thought she loved had never really existed at all. The victim support group that Margaret, Jessica, Sarah, and I had formed grew into something larger and more meaningful than any of us had anticipated. We met weekly at first, sharing our experiences and helping each other navigate the complex emotions that came with being systematically betrayed. Word spread through social media and local news coverage, and other women began joining us, not just Larry's victims, but women who had been targeted by similar predators. Pamela threw herself into the healing process with the same determination she'd once applied to her studies and career. She took a leave of absence from work to attend therapy, to understand how she'd been manipulated, and to identify the warning signs she'd missed. She read extensively about financial fraud, emotional manipulation, and the psychology of con artists. 6 months after the wedding that never was, Pamela started volunteering with organizations that helped fraud victims rebuild their lives. She spoke at conferences about recognizing manipulation tactics, helped other young women understand the difference between healthy romance and predatory behavior, and used her own experience to educate others about the sophisticated methods modern con artists employed. Watching my daughter transform her humiliation into purpose reminded me why I had fought so hard to protect her. The woman who emerged from Larry's betrayal was stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than the one who had walked down that aisle in her wedding dress. She had inherited not just Larry's stubborn streak, but my resilience, and she was using both to ensure that other women wouldn't suffer as we had. On a warm evening in late spring, I stood in my garden holding the wedding dress one final time. The local museum had agreed to include it in an upcoming exhibit about women's resilience throughout history. The curator had been fascinated by its story, how a symbol of broken promises had become a weapon of justice, how the dress meant to represent one woman's happiest day had instead prevented another woman's greatest tragedy. I folded the dress carefully into its donation box, running my fingers over the silk one last time. It had served its purpose magnificently. For 26 years, it had hung in my closet as a reminder of pain and betrayal. For one perfect afternoon, it had been armor and sword, a ghost from the past that had shattered Larry's carefully constructed lies. As I sealed the box and prepared to take it to the museum, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't Larry's imprisonment or even the money that had been recovered for some of his victims. The greatest victory was the life I had built in spite of his abandonment, a life so full of love, purpose, and genuine relationships that his absence had become completely irrelevant. Standing in my garden as the evening light faded, surrounded by flowers I had planted and tended with my own hands, I understood that sometimes the most complete revenge is simply living well. If this story of justice and family secrets kept you captivated, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Amanda walked into that wedding wearing the dress Larry gave her 26 years ago, watching his face go white as his past caught up with him. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories of resilience and justice like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.